My name's Sarah, Mary Magdalene Sarah, and I'm sitting in the office of the Filmmakers Co-op, the New American Cinema. We have a benefactor, Charles S. Cohen, who has given us a, this space for a film archive, for film screenings, and we're going to do in-person film screenings in the future, I hope. And I'd like to introduce the co-op team. This is Julie. This is Andre. Andre is the assistant director, and he's going to do the Q&A. And you can write your questions in the chat. And I want to introduce Abigail Child, but I have notes. So Abby Child has been at the forefront of experimental media and writing since the 1980s and has completed over 50 films and videos and installations and written 6 books. She's an acknowledged pioneer in montage. She addresses the interplay between sound and image. Make, in the words of the LA Weekly, brilliant, exciting work of vibrant political filmmaking that's attentive to form. And I think is very much like the East Village, like New York. It has that dynamics, the rhythm. It's like jazz. Her major projects include Is This What You Were Born For? It was a 9-year project. It's 7-part series. B-Side, a film that negotiates the politics of inner colonialism. 8 Million, a collaboration with avant-garde percussionist Ikuwe Mori that redefines music video. The Suburban Trilogy, a modular digi-film that prismatically examines the politics of place and identity and mirror worlds. A multi-screen installation that incorporates part of Abby's foreign film series to explore narrative accesses. Her most recent work is a trilogy of feature films, including Unbound, an imaginary home movie of the life of Mary Shelley, the teenage author of Frankenstein, and imaginary home movies of Mary Shelley's life. Acts and intermissions on the life and loves of anarchist Emma Goldman in America. I saw that at MoMA. And the third and her most recent, Origins of the Species, which explores human machines interactions, scientific ethics in the 21st century, which premiered November 2020 in Dock, New York. Launching this spring on iTunes. She's the winner of the Rome Prize, a Radcliffe Institute Fellowship, a Guggenheim, a Fulbright, a Stan Brakhage Award. Is there really a Stan Brakhage Award? As well as participating in 2 Whitney biennials, 1989-97. Child has had numerous retrospectives worldwide and been in hundreds of film festivals, and is an amazing friend and a brilliant artist. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Abby Child to you tonight.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Can everybody hear me? I hope so. Thank you, Thank you, the Film Co-op, Henri, and thank my panelists, Ken, Ruth, and Melissa, my co-panelists, and the audience for being here. Another day on Zoom. Thanks so much. I'm going to just introduce quickly the panel. There is all this academic stuff that we all list, and you've probably heard before, but it helps for the people who don't know. Most of you do probably know most of the panelists. But first of all, I just want to thank especially as an experimental filmmaker and the executive director of the Filmmakers Co-op, that she's really brought it, avant-garde film across the world and really focused on women filmmakers. And that was her first idea to celebrate my work under sort of the Women's Month. So I just want to thank her. particularly. Then I'm going to introduce in kind of reverse order in which they will speak is first Ken Jacobs, amazing filmmaker who I met in person on Canal Street, walking way back in the 80s with Flo and him, and constantly both exchanging points of view and both oppositional and complementary. And he's an amazing, yes, he's an amazing filmmaker. Certainly, we all know Tom Tom, the Piper's son, but one of my favorites is Star Spangled to Death, this amazing 7-hour opus on the State of the Union. And I've seen it at least 3 times. The first time at the Collective for Living Cinema behind white sheets with rear projection. So performance plus single screen, it was a knockout. His works in 3D and sound are ingenious dissections and thrilling reconstructions of the world. His material encompasses pornography, narrative, science fiction, and science footage and fragmentary documentary. See his perfect film, which is on Malcolm X's death in Brooklyn. Rather actually in Harlem. And so many fantastic movies. He taught at the cinema department at Binghamton, inspiring subsequent filmmakers for many years, and including making many filmmakers who are my colleagues. Tribute to Ken. Ruth, I met at the Cologne Feminist Film Festival in the early 90s. She was the gorgeous woman in a beautiful white shirt. And we connected really fabulously about film and life, and we've remained friends ever since. She's an artist and curator with an MFA and a PhD with a dissertation from University of Westminster on 21st century avant-garde, new vernaculars, and the feminine écriture, which includes really important work on younger, I guess, am I younger now? I don't know, but we seem to constantly be the next generation coming to attention. And she includes work on both me and many other of my colleagues. Her own work is eclectic, deep, always really thoughtful, philosophic, and strong with eclectic musical elements. She's received an Arts Council grant, a Jarman Award nominee, and had solo shows in Berlin, London, America, and we'll have a coming up one in Vienna. I love this comment. It's Chris Kraus and Dina Johnston about her most recent work called her the Patti Smith of film. And for those of you who have seen her picture in the advertising of this panel, you will probably agree. And she's currently at work on a new film and an experimental novel. Okay, next is Melissa Ragona, who I first saw in a show in the audience with her hair all cut off in Berlin. And that was like in '89. And then in '94, I met her in New York at MoMA at another film screening, actually a screening of Julie Zando's film. So the cross references are multiple. She's an associate professor of critical theory and art history at the School of Carnegie Mellon University, as well as an independent curator and critic. Her book manuscript, The Warhol Tapes Beyond Ready-Made Sound, is coming up. Her essays and reviews have appeared in October Freeze art papers and numerous collections. She's also published monograms on Carolee Schneemann, Paul Scharitz, Antoine Catala, Angela Dufresne, and Abby, myself. Ragona has curated exhibitions and served as curatorial consultant, both in Pittsburgh and at PPOW in New York, as well as MoMA. She's lectured at Princeton, Yale, and Finland, and in London at the Tate Modern, and in Berlin. What's most amazing about Melissa for me is she is one of the few people I know who reads philosophy, even in German, for fun. She's one of the deeper thinkers and one of the best theoretical workers in film and art critique. So I welcome her to open up this panel. It's your floor.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was so beautiful. I'm just honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me, both Abby and Sarah. I just think it's just so wonderful to be doing this homage/critical discussion. I love the incredible illustrious company with Ken Jacobs and Ruth Novacek, who I've also known for quite a while, in and out of different scenes. Ken doesn't remember, but we were on a panel together at Yale, where we bonded over our critique of queer theory. We can talk about that later, and Jack Smith, et cetera. Queer aesthetics, it was actually. I have a lot to say about that. Anyhow, going back to this, so I'm going to present a little semi-formal, just a paper. I'm going to read and come up off the page as much as possible because I know that can be painful. I have a lot of images, and then I think it's going to loosen up a little bit, but still be really rigorous, I think, with Ruth Novacek speaking about both mutiny and mercy. And then Ken is going to follow up, speaking on probably B-side and acts and intermissions, and maybe also pointing to Origin of the Species, all films by Abby. And then Abby is going to fill in the rest. Okay. All right. Great. So, and please, yeah, put your questions in Q&A and we'll start, you know, as you remember them. And at the end, we'll do that. And we'll have a little panel thing and then we'll open it up. So we're not going to try to go too long, like 45, 50 minutes in this presentation and then like 20 minutes of Q&A. All right. So I need to share my screen because I have a little PowerPoint. All right. Cool. And let me go view slideshow. Boom, that's the title. Soundspace, Abigail Child's audition. In the spring of 1967, can you hear me? I just want to make sure that's working. Yeah, good. So in the spring of 1967, Abigail Child wandered into the Dom, or the Dome, on St. Mark's in the East Village and walked into one of Andy Warhol's first renditions of what came to be known as his Exploding Plastic Inevitable, which you see here, or EPI. Multiple film projectors, up to 5 at a time, projected different reels of the same film, as well as several other films, mobile slide projectors, images sweeping across the floor, strobe, pistol and colored gel spotlights pulsed. The audience was awash in colored light. Loudspeakers blasted pop hits. Gerald Malanga, Mary Warrenoff, and Ingrid Superstar danced wildly, donning whips and interacting aggressively with the audience. Nice. So I want to start here because Warhol's expanded cinema is equally as the films of Dziga Vertov that you see here, Arthur Lipsitt, Ken Jacobs, and Peter Kubelka, just to name a few. Influenced Child's filmic lexicon on many, many levels. Sensory systems of sound, image, and performance entered her work throughout the beginning of her filmmaking career, most notably in the more controlled atmosphere of her television documentaries about urban gangs and drug warfare in the 1970s. And she'll talk to you later about that a little bit. But would achieve full expression in her magnum opus, Is This What You Were Born For? From 1981, right, to 89. Though Child only began constructing film installations in the last 10 years, her early work was informed deeply by the kind of spatialization that filmmakers like Warhol and Paul Scherretz would achieve through their experimentation with audio recording and sound composition. In a sense, her Born For series is a kind of experimental score, informed by both John Cage's redefinition of silence as all sound, as well as the tape experiments, electroacoustic and compositional work of those associated with or in conflict with Pierre Schaeffer's Musique Concrète, movement in France and abroad, which included people like Oliver Messiaen, Pierre Boulez, Daphne Aram, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Edgar Varese, Yanis Xenakis, Luciana Berio, Mauricio Kagel, and Delia Derbyshire. In particular, this notion of sonorous objects, sounding objects, revealed to us only by listening, populate the work of Child. However, also at the center of her sound worlds, influencing the way she approached both voice and filmic editing pace, was the music of Sun Ra, of Nina Simone, of Otis Redding, of Ornette Coleman, and the experimental sound of Pauline Oliveros. Ben Patterson and Laurie Spiegel, who's also featured on the soundtrack in her most recent film, Origin of the Species, that she'll talk about later. A Child's soundtrack is an acousmatic composition. Even when the source of the sound is shown on screen, it is so fleeting that we quickly forget its source, or it merges with other sound and image sources at lightning speed, delivering a weave of rigorous performance, improvisation, and surprise sonic attacks. Child claims that if she hadn't become a filmmaker, she would have been a composer. Thus, it's no mistake that sound and experimental music are major shape-shifting forces in her work. Child's soundtracks, especially those composed, edited, and rehearsed and improvised for the Born For series, are studies in the innovations of second-generation post-World War II experimental music and noise composers. She also worked closely with New York downtown sound-oriented artists, musicians, composers, such as Ikewe Mori, Christian Marclay, Anthony Coleman, Jim Black, Zena Parkins, Polly Bradfield, who you see featured here in Mutiny, Shelley Hirsch, and Charles Noyes. Child was able to harness the lessons she learned from Cage about indeterminacy and chance, as well as the more performative ideas she gleaned from Coggle about radiogenic voice and absurdist found theater. In her Born For series, Child amplifies these traditions through the scratch and sampling materiality of turntablism, like a Christian Marclay, and who features, and I'll talk about him in a minute later, or the voice shredding virtuosity of Shelley Hirsch. Her own talents in manipulating ready-made sounds that she collected from soap operas, interviews, educational tapes, poetry readings cannot be underestimated. Child's agility with editing sound is as facile as her approach to image montage. She often invited musicians to perform to the image after she'd already created a foundational soundtrack. I'll never forget the time, as a little personal anecdote, that Abby invited me to experience one of these live sessions with Ikewe Mori, who you see here featured, and they often perform together still, and Zena Parkins and Christian Marclay, performing live in the sound mixing studio at Harvest Works back in early 2000, when she was laying down the soundtrack for her fabulous film, Surface Noise. I was absolutely entranced watching the three of them respond, well, four of them with Abby, and the sound mixer, Paul Geluso, with unexpected sound relations to Abby's fast-paced editing. Parkins on electronic harp, Maury on keyboards. Marclay had stacks and stacks of fabulous LPs that were so well used that they seemed like vinyl pancakes. Literally, they kind of were like being slapped one after the other with lightning speed on and off his portable turntable as he was trying to keep pace. But that's also part of his work, right? That pace. It was such an equal kind of wonderful exchange. So in a sense, she worked with several levels of scores. One that she already had laid down herself, the other created by the image sets that would direct and guide the composers or performers she would invite to contribute to her soundtracks. The entire Born For series was planned as a study in different applications of cinematic sound. Prefaces is constructed around wild sound. Mutiny is a study in synchronous sound. Covert Action focuses on voiceover. Both is a contemplation in silence. Peril plays critically with found cartoon sound, referencing Disney's Mickey Mousing effects. Mayhem, which many of you know, is a noir sound, such a masterpiece, is a noir sound menu delighting in a hard-boiled exchange of fragmented dialogue, as well as the emotional effects of leitmotifs. And finally, Mercy circles back to wild sound. But if one were to step back, listening to and looking at the entire Born For score as a whole, one is able to hear and see recurring conceptual strategies the child adopts in terms of sound-image relations that skate over the top of conventional cinematic sound categories: gestural, televisual, textual, phono, and vocographic. Then within and across each strategy, Child employs an editing techniques that borrow from contemporary experimental and popular music, glitch sampling, mashup, scratching, and shredding. Most critics have approached Child's work through the notion of collage or cut up, the latter inspired by the work of Romare Bearden, William Burroughs, Brian Geeson across visual art, literature, and film. And certainly, as Child herself intones, collage has been a key strategy of her work, both visually and orally. She produced a series of intricate decoupages in the 1980s, as well as a set of more recent works on paper in this vein. However, I'll argue that collage is one approach among many in Child's work, and overemphasizing it defangs the kind of sonic violence that her sound film work evokes. Moreover, the speed in which Child edits sound in analog form produces effects usually found in digitally mastered sound works dependent on complex software programs. And I mean that, and I think you believe that. The sensory overload that most viewers experience when watching an Abigail Child film, especially one from the period of the Born For series, is often described as almost too much for a single sedentary sitting. One wishes one could move through the sound and images, to borrow from Gary Morris, as if they were confetti. To quote him directly, whoops, Mayhem has a shotgun editing style that rains over the viewer like confetti. As I mentioned earlier, Warhol's Exploding Plastic Inevitable was one of the earliest expanded media events of Child's own viewing experience. Others were to follow. The fabulous soundlight rooms of Lamont Young and Marian Zazela's Dream House. The anti-Pythagorean overtones of Tony Conrad's new minimalist music and flicker environments. The nervous magic lantern of Ken Jacobs and Flo, his steady collaborator throughout this incredible run, as well as the all-enveloping voice-centered concerts of Meredith Monk and Yoko Ono, informed by projects that emphasize sound's spatializing effect, as well as her own experimentations in paratactical sound-image relations. Child's more recent structural move has been toward multi-screen installations that incorporate various films and loops, including Dark Dark, Cake and Steak, To and Fro. Oh, there's another Cake and Steak. To and No Fro, By Desire, that I don't have a image of, Blonde Fur, what do I have here? Yes, and Mirror Worlds. In these works, one can still hear the acuity of sound composition developed in the Born For series, but much more space has been provided for the exchange between image and sound. Sound in many ways is foregrounded, especially in our most recent performance of Mirror Worlds, that combines Mirror World with Dark Dark and To and No Fro together as a 3-screen projection. Mehboob Khan's classic Bollywood feature, On, is the primary footage that Child reworks in Mirror World. It runs continuously on the middle screen, using a video mirroring effect to double the lush images of landscape, dance, and the ornate palace of an irate Indian princess. The remixing of Nashad Ali's extravagant orchestral soundtrack, composed by Ali using a 100-piece orchestra, up and against the dark, sultry themes of Morricone's work, featured in the soundtrack for Dark Dark, expands this lavishness even more. Trusting the denseness of sound and color, Child unimpacks in a sense. Boy, my slides are moving automatically because I must have a magic touch screen wand thing going on. Trusting the denseness of sound and color, Child unimpacks in a sense some of the intricately woven, almost airtight image patterns previously in the Born For series. Moreover, the use of kind of world music, Indian, Japanese, Italian, German, Latin American, is more readily discernible and perhaps more consciously employed in Child's more spatially designed works. As in the work of minimalist composers like Lamont Young or Steve Reich, Child has used and continues to use an ethnographic exploration of cross-cultural music in order to study social and political identity through structure rather than essentialist categories. For example, in Steve Reich's early phase experiments, he takes the recorded voice of Daniel Hamm, a young African-American boy who'd been wrongfully arrested and beaten in the Harlem riots of '64, and re-records his statements. I'm going to open it up, many of you know this, and let the blood come out to show them, right? And he records them on two channels that eventually slip out of phase from one another and then become eventually extremely abstract. And I also put in here the wonderful revisiting that Glenn Ligon has done of the Come Out series in print, however, just to talk about how also that spatialization then goes the other way, right? Where sound then is spatializing image or here text as installation. But this piece has come to represent one of the most pivotal moments in American civil rights history, as well as one of the major contributions in experimental music in terms of rethinking speech through the materiality of magnetic tape of the recording process. Similarly, Child's film confronts issues of gender, race, class, and ethnicity by intervening at the level of cultural reproduction, by interrupting, stretching, and shredding the recorded documents of the culture industry. Whether it's at the level of the phonemic or the single frame as in prefaces, or the gestural event of movement as in mutiny, or the broadcast technologies of radio and television as in Perils and Mayhem, or the open sonic space of her installations as in Mirror Worlds, Blonde Fur, and Hacking Empire, a quite recent one. Child uses sound to politicize her work at the level of its production. This is the best, the most hard-hitting position for Child's audition. The end of mine. The next person who's going to go on is Ruth, but I want to say one quick thing is that in the larger version of this, I talk all about the poets. And, you know, because Steve Benson and Carla Harriman actually are an important part of the soundtrack for Covert Action. We see images of Bruce Andrews, the Bernstein sometimes, but people like Erica Hunt, Hannah Weiner, right? All these poets were very important. And Abby, as a poet herself, right, was very involved. And that really also influences these sound worlds very deeply. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and we'll talk more in the Q&A and hand this over to Ruth Novacek from London. Incredible artist.
Hi, am I I'm unmuted. Okay. So, this is very informal. I encountered Abby's films at the London Filmmakers Co-op when I was a
Ruth, you're muted. You have to unmute.
Oh, right, okay. But I seem to...
We can't hear you.
My audio is not muted right now, but somebody needs to unmute me because...
No, I can hear you now, sorry.
Can you hear me? Okay.
That was my fault.
Okay, so I first encountered Abby's films at the London Filmmakers Co-op when I was a student at St. Martin's School of Art. And it was like I'd been watching these so-called experimental films as part of my BA in experimental film, and nothing really spoke to me until I watched, I think it was Mayhem, Mercy, and Covert Action. And I was completely mind blown. It's like, that was the kind of film I was looking for. And, you know, the repetition, the East Village, and rewatching for this, I was like, wow, it was so ahead of its time. It's like all the diversity that we've been talking about for like years. I mean, how long ago was this in the 80s? Like years ago, right? 30 something years ago, like diversity. And then talking about mutiny, you know, athletes, dancers, found footage, live action, East Village, you know, the whole thing. It's just like there. I would say, yeah, collage is a mistake you know, it's too, it's too simple, but it's like definitely the mosaic, the bricolage, the sound bites, the way the sound works, the way the sound is also like, there's a humor and at the same time a huge critique that I found myself thinking, oh, it's in the rewatching, like it's so different to Yvonne Rainer, for instance, you know, where there's choreography, but it's kind of, you know, the rhythm and the structure and the repetition and the refusal of narrative, the texture and the mood. And I found myself wondering on the rewatching of Mutiny, is like, how on earth, Abby, do you end your films? Because suddenly the ending's there and it's like, okay, and then you kind of notice. And then moving on to Mercy, like, okay, the other thing that struck me is the font in the titles, you know, like, wow. And, you know, that it's kind of absurdism. It's sexy. It's like the whole kind of mood, like there was nothing going on from women's film in the 80s, or as far as I could see, that expressed either the fragmentation of memory and experience, but also I started to think, hang on a minute, this is like Basquiat, you know, there's a kind of portrayal of America or Americana that, you know, Basquiat gets it, you know, just his little kind of details, the dollar signs or whatever, like they just sum up America, you know, politically and from a particular perspective that I just found so fascinating, both in the 80s when I first saw these films and now rewatching them, the effect hasn't really changed for me. This kind of the absurdity of American optimism, the kind of well, I would call them incoherent sounds and sound bites. This kaleidoscopic, trippy sort of live action melding together with the found footage, so that they fit so well you can hardly tell which is which. And it's strange to watch from here, from this kind of pandemic isolation, you know, to kind of see this East Village that I knew in the 90s when I was living there, when I was hanging out a bit with you, and sort of realizing, like, from the very beginning, Abby's films spoke to me, and they were Abby and Chantal Akerman, completely different perspective, but like, wow. Oh, and Maya Deren. But I was really struck when I was a student, and again when I was a PhD student, of like how there was so few films that I really related to. And, you know, I never really liked Stan Brakhage. I was always kind of arguing with the sort of parochial British filmmakers co-op about this kind of, you know, this canonized kind of thing. And I remember, like, you know, Abby's films were not, in fact, I curated Abby's films in Northern Ireland along with some other filmmakers at a certain point, because they did express for me this kind of fabulously diverse, intersectional, political, militant vision, but kind of, there's no, my films are more romantic, nostalgic, yearning, whereas Abby's just aren't. You know, it's like Americana with a Soviet edge or something. And then I watched Blue Edit and I thought, oh, wow, you know, Blue Edit is like the 21st century version of the 20th century, Is This What You Were Born For? You know, but using a kind of completely different aesthetic, the 21st century aesthetic that I struggle with. And I remember once I had this conversation with Abby, like in the 90s in New York, about, oh, everybody wants you to kind of move on. I think we were talking about Sadie Benning. Everybody wants us to make feature films. And it was kind of like, but we don't make short films, and they're compressed, and they're a poetic condensation, and they're kind of really, they're not, they're sort of mashups, but they're not flash frames. They're not sort of trying to sell anything. They're, sex positive, but without a kind of, and this imagery without that understated, but yet it isn't. There's another kind of radical militancy going on that's kind of based in humor, which personally I find very Jewish. I find Abby's films relatable because there's a kind of Jewishness that I relate to, especially in the trilogy, which I'm not going to talk about here. But yeah, that's, I think, yeah, and I love the kind of edge of neurosis. And also I thought rewatching Mercy is that I was thinking about Buñuel, another filmmaker that, got through my gatekeeping of what I couldn't stand and what I loved and what I hated. So, because I was so opinionated and closed in those days. It's like experimental film is so boring and Abby isn't. And, Abby's funny and deep and interesting, and it was great to kind of be invited to rewatch these films from, me in 1983 or whatever, as a student watching these films, and then now, and sort of thinking, well, actually, they haven't dated. They haven't changed for me. Like, they still express the same thing, but like, now Abby's made some feature lengths. I haven't, and I won't. We both write poetry, and yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Awesome. So now we're going to hear, thank you so much, Ruth. That was so wonderful to hear. Ken Jacobs, we'd love you to do some Abby-ness.
I'm awed by Abby. Can you hear that? She's relentlessly creative. I looked at her recent work this last week, and it blew my mind. I have to comment about the last film I saw, about the robots, because it's so terrifying. And it left me with many questions, which I'd love to address to her and have her answer. Why did you not show the genitals of the robots that had been being made towards the end of the film? We see all these female bodies, these white female bodies, and we understand they're made to perhaps replace human sex slaves. That's what it seems like. Why you, of all people, holding back and holding genitals on showing genitals?
I show the genitals are there. All the vaginas are lined up. The guy says you can pick your vagina. Maybe you missed that. They're all the nipples and the vagina. Weird. I didn't avoid it at all. It's there. I don't know if you saw it.
Are these crazy people?
To you and me, perhaps, but what the guy says is, I think, his authentic feeling that there are a number of people who have trouble relating to other human beings, so they pick a doll and have sex with a doll. For you and I, that may be ridiculous, but what? Let me back up a little and just say, this was the last of this trilogy on women and failed ideology. And I had started with this idea of Mary Shelley. I mean, I was thinking about what is it to be a woman and what is in our way and how do we succeed? Women, we want everything. And what is the obstruction in our lives. And so I got intrigued with Mary Shelley because of an incredible biography on her and relating to sort of hippiedom. She's 16 or 17 and she runs away with a man who's married, who has a kid, and whose wife is pregnant. Percy Shelley. It would be shocking now, and it was certainly shocking in 1812 or when it happened. So what I saw was she lived with Shelley for 8 years. She had 5 children, 4 of them died. And basically the ideology I felt was 19th century romanticism, which perhaps was fantastic for poetry, but really difficult for a woman in that position. And then as I was thinking about it and working on it, I thought of 20th century. I thought I can go through the centuries with this. And I thought of Emma Goldman and anarchy. And for her, again, love got displaced in her ideation of herself as a political being dedicated to anarchy and dedicated to political activism. So every time she was a very passionate human being. She would connect with someone and they would say, you can't go out anymore. You have to stay home. So that was always a struggle in her life. She couldn't reconcile her love life and her ideational life, right? And then I thought, okay, for the 21st century, what is the ideology that governs the 21st century? And despite Trumpism, I would say it's science. I would say science is our God, if you will. I mean, if it's not art, it's science. And I thought, I'm not going to go with a live woman scientist. I'm going to go with the virtual woman. And that's how I ended up I'm also, I loved comic books. I loved science fiction. So androids became an attractive place for that virtual woman. And it is interesting, of course, we have Siri. They're just changing her now to be a male voice, but it's a female voice. When I asked the guy at that Robotex, about that Siri is female and that he's making all these female dolls, he said, well, women are nicer and women, are softer and women are easier. I mean, all the, predictability of cultural, absolutes or cultural error maybe. So that's what pushed me to do this film, to think about this film as a kind of closure of this sequence of features. And I love that Ruth said we talked about short films and long films. And when I talk, I'll talk about, in some ways, I think I also did these feature films to learn, I've been doing a lot of short films and I thought of them as quartets or songs, and I thought I want to know how to cover time as a symphony, because when time expands the rhythms have to change, everything is in a different space, and I think that's why Melissa and I had talked about this, why I have done series in the past, because doing series is a way to cover time with these small bits, and that may be for me something I'm going to go back to. I find it really intriguing. So anyway, that's so I don't think I avoided sex. I think you just maybe didn't see that part. There are all these nipples, there are all these breasts, and there's a whole series of vaginas. Now, I didn't see a whole series of penises, it's true. And when I asked the guy, because they do have a few male dolls, you could see them. They were the blue figures for anybody who's seen the film towards the end. And I said, well, who are the purchasers? And he said, it's almost all men. It's men for the women dolls, the female shaped dolls, and it's men for the male dolls. So, I don't know, I'm making a joke, whatever. And he said, the only women who seem to buy them are artists. And actually, I was in Soho before COVID. And in fact, there was one of the Robotex dolls in somebody's art piece, where they bought, and the dolls are expensive. So they bought a $5,000 doll to put in an art piece. So I didn't avoid the sexuality. I thought that was sort of the point of the whole film, is it's all these guys making these perfect women.
Perfect.
I mean, I even thought, the Geminoid, the guy at the beginning, Ishiguro, I mean, he's fabulously inventive, but he uses cosmetic surgery as a way to model the women. So indeed, this is and I didn't have the money or the time, but it turns out in Canada there's a prostitute house of robot dolls, And basically, you know, you get a half hour, an hour with your robot doll, and then there's a team of people cleaning them up, right? You have to clean the doll up after the sexual encounter. And it was going to be in Texas. They were opening one in Texas, but they vetoed it. You know, America is still somewhat puritanical. Anyway, so yeah, I'm not sure I did that. But I'd love, you know, you could talk about B-side. That would be interesting too. B-side and accent intermissions, unless you, I mean, yes, I mean, for me, the scariest part in the Android film, or the most amazing, not scary, is where the paraplegic has his head, um, has his skull lifted off, where they put in wires that connect to the part of the brain that controls the arm and the hand, and the guy can think movement. Well, that's totally crazy, fabulous stuff, right? I mean, it's truly sci-fi. If I could think and open a door with my thought, how crazy is that?
B-side, I thought was a wonderful film. I loved it. But this film you're talking about right now blows my mind. What can you think about after this thing? You know, we are, so much of us, robotic. You know, we wear our glasses the right way. We dress in public. You know, we do so many things that are already a menu. We follow a menu. It's very, we become artists very much to break out of this
Absolutely.
system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and you got it then, because that is, of course, it's a mirror of us. And that's why for me, there's a shot from Metropolis where the workers, I mean, they knew it then in 1930 or 1920, the workers are working in, and the robot voice is talking, and you wonder, who's the robot? You know, is it, and I mean, not to put down workers, but they're shot in Metropolis like multiples. And I think of Arthur Lipsett, you know, with his film where he says, we're a number. And that's way back in the 60s, you know.
You
We
had
were
it,
coming it all along, you know.
right.
I mean,
So
it's also very Foucaultian, you know, we're in the system. We're born in that system. And yeah. I mean, I have more to say, but there you
same
go.
one. Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking in my comments, I wanted to say, if everybody's going to talk about my films that I have done, I wanted to talk about the future. And as an artist, what I ask myself is, what is needed? You know, what needs to be done? And I was trying to come up with elements. And one of the elements was, you know, we're in a digital age, you know, digitism. And I was thinking, the great advantage of digital, and you're doing it in your work as well, is it's not just an edit machine, it's also a copying machine, so that you can print, you can duplicate, just what Ruth was saying, well, about that I was doing in analog early on, but the repetition, the reversal, you can play with the film. But also digital, we become part of the industry in a way. And I was thinking of it multiply. Partly, we have to pay for Adobe to be on Pro Tools. I mean, I'm still using Final Cut Pro so to avoid it. But, and also cameras, digital cameras have effects that make it look like film, quote unquote, look like film. It never does, but to look like film. And you can put a scratch on your digital thing so it looks like film. So the effect makes film nostalgic, right? Just what Ruth was saying in a way. And so that as we go in the digital age, we become compromised in part, even for the things it lets us do that we couldn't do before. There's this increasing incorporation. And I remember Brackage would talk about video as water, and I never understood it. But looking at digital, it is so smooth. It's so super real. Everything slips off. It doesn't have any grit. You know, it doesn't have the grit of film. Even the fact that film got hair in it and got scratched. I mean, I hated when it got scratched, but film has dimensionality. For any of you in the audience who did film. If you put it in wrong side up, it would be out of focus because just that tiny little sliver of depth made a difference. There's no depth in digital. And so, I mean, I can talk more about that. But anyway, so that idea that we're immersed, we become part of the industry through digitization and the robot, our own science, our, even that we're on Zoom, what is happening to us with this screen reality? How will it affect children? You know, how do you develop through isolation? Do you develop through isolation? So, I mean, I have notes to say other stuff.
I would love to hear more. We do develop in isolation, and we develop in society. Okay, we develop both ways.
Yeah.
Until very recently, I was very critical of seeing kids pushed around in strollers and looking at their screens, not looking at the world passing around them, not learning the world, learning
Right.
screens. And I was very critical, and that I can't be critical anymore because the new world is this. It is this. You know, we ourselves, as I said before, are very robotized. You know, when you talk about film having a scratch, we try to escape those scratches. We try in every way to avoid the image being scratched. We love the video image because it's only artificially scratched.
But I will say, avant-garde musicians even have essays about that as technology increased, they went for more grit, more roughness, more scratching, because you said it, as artists, we want to escape the robotization. So we go in reverse of what's
We're
happening.
fools. We're fools. That's sentimentality. You know.
Maybe. No, you're right. It could be. It could be. It's true. I like a clean image, but I mean, you look at Blue Edit, it's shot with an iPhone, and it's, beautiful. Ruth, thank you. I don't know if Blue Edit is what you said it is, but I really appreciated that comment.
I love your work,
Thank you.
and I'm awed by it, really awed. And you work so much. You are always going. You know.
As are you. I'm always impressed.
But I'm also a habit.
Yes, exactly. We're a habit. We're a habit. There you go. I can't not do work. Just
In a minute, we should probably move to the questions from the audience because they're piling up.
are they okay?
but
I did.
I wanted, did you want to say a few more things, Abs, before we, or Ken?
Yes, I had a couple of, looking to the future, I wanted to talk about genre, that genres are more mixed than ever, both in music and in film. And I wanted to say, in some ways, I think there's partially influenced by COVID. There's been a loss of the community of the avant-garde. And I think what's really, a more positive view might be that it's extended into the documentary world and into the installation world, and it's influenced them so that you could think of it in a more positive thing rather than completely a loss. I talked about the digital, but not really some of the very specific things I did. Maybe people will ask about that. I guess I also wanted to talk about excess and leftovers, that here we're in a level of climate change, and how do we work with the world we're given. And I think actually the idea of the old and the new, the opposition between the original and the derived, is particularly interesting when you look at found material. Instead of make it new, the Poundian dictum from the beginning of the last century, at the beginning of the 21st, it's been formulated to make it fucked up or redo it. Appropriation, cut and paste. It's now copy and paste, of course. And wait a minute, I want to see my words. And its array is social and collective. And I would see garbage as the refuge of the unknown. Leftovers are what we make for a meal. The richness of the found, of what comes your way. And this may be a saving grace for a world that has too much garbage. How do we remake the world? Ruth, what do you want to say?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, how many generations of film formats and video formats we've lived through. And the tech, I'm so aware of it. And yeah, we've been through all these and the fact that with all our screens, like most of my students now are like constantly like scrolling, and I'm very aware of the fact that actually we've lost the ability to kind of, like the babies in strollers with their iPads, to look at the world. And how do we look at the world? And I'm really aware that I learned to draw at art school, like to draw from life, like your hand-eye coordination, and then Super 8 film, 16mm film, then early video formats. So I've got like drawers and drawers of like cameras to play the tapes of the old stuff, and there's too much stuff because video introduced 24/7 real life. You could, for no money, you could just record a whole 1 hour. And I think this is still something that we as the avant-garde, in isolation or whatever we are, and feminists and all the other stuff, and militants and leftists, we're trying to kind of find a way, because yeah, you're right, the Puritanism as well of like America, and of England, and of all the Protestant cultures. We're just thrown headlong.
I just wanted to interject, and then I hope we can go to audience questions before we lose people, but I wanted to say that I think everything everyone's saying is really valid, but I wanted to say, there is that wonderful, that many of you know, Hito Sterl essay that talks about, the degradation of the image that also opens up a new democracy of the image. And I think that Abby's work now digitally also is starting to do that, so that, we always think of this, like early on when I was in the avant-garde film community, just viewing things like anthology and part of discussions, the purity of film was a big deal. It was like, who was I trying to think of? Like a Nick Dorsky, like a Nick Dorsky film, right? Where there's just they're gorgeous, but it's the absolute ecstasy of 16mm, right? That, without sound, it's light, right? And material, and that's amazing. But I think there was a romanticism tied to that early on. Brackage had that early on as well. And so I think that Abby, you already sullied a lot of.
I was always impure.
Yeah, you were impure from the beginning. So your kind of invasion into structuralism with sex, eroticism, gender, class stuff, poverty. I know Ken addresses that too in his work, throughout, like the politics of the inequalities. And I know that, Ken, like I was reading something on you recently, you've become less, you said in a way your films have become less political in a way, and more about the purity of effects, or am I misquoting you?
Painting, maybe, back to painting.
Because now you're kind of painting, doing these incredible works, but I wonder, is that a misquote, or do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, but I think I've given myself permission as an old guy to deal with the stuff I'm fascinated with, and not to complain so much. I've made my complaints. You know about them. There's not much I can add to that. For now, it's this medium, this incredible thing that we're given this latitude to work with. Abigail, by the way, your name is one of the most beautiful names, Abigail Child, I've ever heard. Beautiful name. We're trapped, okay? You're gonna work like hell the rest of your life. Romantic stuff is a fantasy about breaking out of the workings of the world. We can't break out. You can do things that are madly, seemingly in opposition to the way things are, but that's mad. That's what they are.
Right.
You know, and they can be beautiful as mad pieces. You know,
Right. No,
it's
yeah.
it's our devilish rebellion against against the automatic.
And that's a brilliant sentence. The devil, against the automatic. But that's really all that we can do because, in politics, what they say is you may not win, but without opposing, even in your aim to oppose, you can't even begin to change anything. And there is some change. I mean, the world. I'm glad I'm born in the time I'm born. I'm glad I wasn't born in the 16th century. I'd be a peasant hoeing potatoes.
You'd be burned at the stake.
There you go.
You
You're
would. You would absolutely be burned at the stake.
right,
You're,
probably.
you're too
I
old.
always felt that
You're
about
too ugly.
Cuba too, that I would
Yeah,
talk.
sure it would.
I'd be in trouble.
But Ken, you're a warlock too, so might have happened to you too. I want to just, there's messages here. I want to combine a few questions and go to the audience right now. And then some people might want to ask a live question. But let me just, for the people who've already put loaded questions here, Barbara Latanzi, the fabulous filmmaker, is here and asks, accent intermissions impressed me for city crowds and the continuum of crowds across time and their collective agency. Emma Goldman's role seemed a way to engage the agency of huge populations that move through cities like a single creature in action. Do you have a comment about urban culture and these kinds of relationships?
Oh my God, that's a big question, Barbara. But what would I say? Yes, I do think Emma Goldman's role was that. She was out on the road probably 70% of her life, traveling on trains and cars and being picked up going, there's a list in the film of of some of the places she spoke at in America. Um, but I guess crowds in urban culture right now coming out to Tompkins Square Park seems too crowded for me. Too many people on one hand. On a larger scale, I would say just for me as a filmmaker, this was one of my anecdotes is I thought when I went to college that I'd become an ethnographer of South America because I spoke Spanish and I studied Mayan, Xenacantecan, and Chamulan Indians in Mexico while I was in college. And I didn't become that, but I did think of myself as an ethnographer of city culture and an ethnographer of the body. So I do think I'm kind of registering bodies over time or how I see the body. And I do think what Ruth said was so true that I put together a little photo thing, but it doesn't matter. That one of my things I did in Rome was called Hacking Empire. And I was in Rome looking, and this was in 2010, at the empire, at Roman Empire. I mean, it's there in Rome everywhere you look. 2,000 years ago is very present. The Colosseum has no nails. It was built with slaves from Jerusalem, Jewish slaves, and this was the same moment there was the Mideast War. So I kept thinking that this was this parallel world of a failing empire in the West as well as from Rome. And so I took all the women and children that were in the academy at the time and I made them, because the way Rome got rich was because it took slaves and gold, and slaves were the money then, 2,000 years ago, as it was in America in the South 150 years ago. So I put the women and children as emperors and did a collage of war footage of both Roman, what are they called, costume dramas intercut with the US war. At any way, my point is hacking empire, I realize sort of has been what I've tried to do in all my work. Hack the patriarchy, disengage, deconstruct, and maybe, as Ken says, you are never outside it, but at least I can make the attempt. And I think that's important. I mean, I'm not going to just sit and be a part of it. That was part of my, like you said, to be an artist. I had to break out, have some freedom.
That's a really great answer. I wanted to bring up, there's like 3 different questions around, and I'm combining Steve Benson's with Sally Silver's, and I don't know who else was on that, but this notion of this idea that Steve first brings it up and talks, they're all wanting to talk about movement in your work. And he said to move as an effective thinking is Alexander technique applied, right? And then, there's a little debate here. And Sally's like being kinesthetically aware in the moment as much as possible. So can you talk to that in your work, like the kinesthetic and movement and the
Well,
complexity of it?
sure. I mean, there are always bodies in my work, and I'm really interested in the rhythm of bodies and how they move, and it's what I look at. Dance is a big part of filmmaking, and Sally and I have had conversations about this before. She's in a lot of the films from the '80s, and certainly Cake and Steak, the Suburban Trilogy, which we didn't talk about, which I wish people would, which I think is kind of a furtherance of the Born For series, where Cake and Steak is a kind of panoply of home movies after World War II. And it's all about bodies and gender and class. And Melissa, you brought it up. If I had done B-side in black and white, when I got to the aughts, it's like if I'd been looking at poverty and class with the Suburban Trilogy, I'm beginning to look at the bourgeoisie and critique them, and it goes into color. So it has this excitement of the color and the visual. And then The Futures Behind You is also all about bodies, two sisters growing up and how their bodies move and change. And of course, a la Eisenstein, I'm looking at everything inside that frame, where the bodies move, where they move in relation to the frame, where the light is, what the timing is, how you change that, what the music does as it cuts across the image. So yes, all those things are for real.
Yeah.
Now, no one's talked to, and I just like maybe this would be the end thing, because you brought it up with me, Melissa, but I think it's really essential to what's going on today, again, to think about the future, which is about spectacle and politics and how we look. And again, I'm going to say something, everybody can argue with me, it's fine. It's part of the point of a panel, right? That like the poet Amanda Gorman at Biden's inaugural, who thinks all poetry is political, I think all film is as well. I mean, it can be the politics of poetic form, but I think it's political. And these debates of form versus content, modernism versus postmodernism, political speech versus apolitical form, ambiguity versus accessibility, a big one, radicalism versus populism, are longstanding in all the arts. I want to argue that poetry, the arts, cinema are always an attempt to see the unspoken, to give voice to what is unattended, whatever that may be, rather even as a landscape or a people, an emotion or a shaft of light. So we want what is needed, a return to complexity, to detail, to figure, to a variety of possible subjects and subjective positions, virtuosistic and banal, individual and communal, digressions incorporating error, anxiety, insecurity, and doubt, a kind of plentitude. So how do we look at the other? And Hannah Wiener, the poet friend and voice of my early film prefaces, always said, the other is yourself. Good advice in any time. So what are our responsibility as artists, as filmmakers? I've always thought having a camera itself is privilege. What do we make of that privilege? And then what does it mean to watch? Perhaps this is the question for our day. What with George Floyd, the issue of witnessing gives substance to our watching. The issue of witnessing gives substance to our watching, even as spectacle can be both excuse and space for tyranny. As a college student studying anthropology, I spoke about that. And I was going to say, particularly with a film like B-Side, I had to question myself about my position. I was a witness, but there was distance. And I always think of Nina Fonaroff's fantastic title for her film, Empathy is the Cheapest of Emotions. So profound and crazy at the same time. And it bears on this difficulty of representation. I am not homeless. I can't solve that issue. And I remember this anecdote that Marty Ehrlich and I were standing outside our building on East 8th Street as the homeless, driven by police from Tompkins Square Park, moved into the abandoned couple of lots across from my house. And we said to each other that moment, we turned to each other, we're both Jewish, and we said, we could understand a little bit Germany during the war, because what were we to do with injustice in front of us? How could we help? And I know, I don't mean to simplify these issues, but it was a moment of it coming right in my face, the enormity of the crisis at our door. And, B-side became a story of witnessing, of bearing witness to the status of an event. I was not homeless, but could I document the crisis of people living in dirt lots, literally making homes that look tropical, less than 2 miles from Wall Street? I could try to create a piece of film where one could not forget, where one had to spend 40 minutes facing the homeless. You couldn't just walk away. So maybe that's a place to end or to open up to more questions. I just wanted to make that part of this discussion.
Yeah, and I just wanted, that's so beautifully articulated, Abigail, because we were talking at length before this about witnessing. And I just wanted to say, I remember how you struggled with B-side.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably one of the most challenging films, I think it was, you did during that period.
Yeah.
And you just kept remaking it and breaking it down and remaking it again and breaking it down. And I think that part of it was that question of, how am I witnessing this? How am I presenting this? And you're combining documentary and fiction.
Right.
Sheila Dabney, who's acting for you, Pamela Sneed, people of color that are, in your community, but at the same time aren't part of the homeless, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's this whole complicated thing with race and class and specificity, Dinkinsville in the East Village, Tent City, all that stuff. And all of you as artists, starting to gentrify the East Village, part of that.
That's right.
Right?
Always
during that period.
The first gentrification, yes.
Want to say something?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Joe Stalin argument. You're making works for a highly sensitized people. How can they actually have a social effect? He said, and probably rightly, however horrible he was, this is not moving masses.
No, I'm not moving masses, but maybe I'm preparing a little bit of the ground for change. That's all I can do. I mean, art does not make you vote in one way or the other, but one can, it did it for me. There was a moment where I watched something and I said, only form changing can change the world, because it could change me. Now, it doesn't do it for everybody. Of course, you're right. But, and this is the issue, the mass accessibility in our small place in the world. But I still, this is what gives me the energy to go on. I'm preparing, really people said, why protest? It doesn't change the votes in the Senate. But if you don't protest, you have to make an effort to say no. I think the power of a no is really essential. Even if it doesn't change it now or exactly, without it, you would truly live in Joseph Stalin land.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask is there anyone out there who has a question live, just wants to ask it on Zoom right now? Yeah, Sandy. You have to unmute. Can we unmute? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute.
Yeah.
This is the question of witnessing has come up because of Darnella, whatever her name is, her video of George Floyd. But it made me think, when I wrote about Night and Fog, I wrote about the transition from observer to witness. The observer just watches and the witness engages in a moral relation with the subject. And that witnessing becomes this power of being able to do something, however small, to create a connection. And that, so I'm intrigued also by this world. I would say when worlds collide, the Camera Obscura issue honoring Agnes Varda just came out today. And there's a ton of stuff that makes me think of Varda, but she circulates in a different world. It's not the experimental film, experimental poetry, all these people I know from the poetry world through Joel. It's not commercial, but it's something in between. And that's Varda. We have a joke about her being a garbage collector. So that has now been something that is part of the issue of this Camera Obscura, issue honoring her, because there are so many dimensions to her work, and she has the opportunity, or had the opportunity, to reach a broader audience, especially when she worked with JR. So I'm kind of thinking it would be terrific if Abigail's work were diffused in a way that it was more available to a wider audience, not the audience of the scholarly elite that we are, or whatever. So it's very exciting. The work is provocative, and I love what Ruth said. I'm happy to speak.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to get it diffused, but it's harder than.
There's material difficulties. I understand that.
I don't know if it's material, social difficulties more than.
Yeah.
Right.
It's combining the worlds, I think, that would be, making the connections between different worlds.
But it's also the Agnes Varda, just to historicize it a little, is there was always that distinction between the American and the European avant-garde, where the European avant-garde was working with features and the American avant-garde was working with shorts in a much more underground sense, whereas Godard and Truffaut, Varda was part of it, and so they were always working out through features and with actually a chain of producers and distributors who took their definitely independent, not big commercial, but got them out in the world. And the American avant-garde didn't have that.
Well, just a point here, it's interesting to say Godard and Truffaut were often credited with starting the new wave when it was Varda's film La Plante Court, made 5 years before. And she always produced her own work. She had Ciné Tamaris, which she started, and was always at odds with the regular production mechanisms. In fact, she refused to work when she went to Los Angeles. And was offered a contract, a chance to work with a big studio, and she refused it. But what's interesting about the shorts versus features and that kind of thing is that magnificent Criterion box set of everything she's ever done has all the features, all the short films, all the sort of, bits around that make her work much more sort of engaged, I think, or engaging. But so she's an odd character in terms of the distribution situation. She was not really considered part of the new wave, except as, she made Cleo from 5 to 7, the best new wave film there is. But it took years for people to acknowledge that.
But that was being a female, I'm sure, no? Didn't that, it wasn't.
Oh, yeah, that had a lot to do with it. The cover of the Camera Obscura is that Con here, just hold it up. That Con, the women making a whole protest statement about the lack of coverage of women's work. And the whole article by Rebecca DeRue is about that Con statement. Yeah, part of it is being a woman, but part of it is refusing the regular distribution channels that were available. And they certainly weren't available to her. I mean, she got much more popular as she got older and more tolerable because she was like the kindly little grandmother type. But when she was a young firebrand,
I'm getting up there. When will I become that grandma?
Yeah, I know, but it is interesting to me, having followed her career, that when she was really just, a firebrand and inventive and radical and critical and everything, was like, meh, she had one footnote in James Monaco's book on the new wave. But now she's gotten a lot more attention. But curiously enough, that JR film that she made, Faces Places, which is not a really great film of hers, but still is much more accessible and goes into the Instagram moment and all that kind of the cardboard cutouts and everything like that. So it's an afterlife. But
I also want, I love that you brought her up, because in relation to Abby too, it's so interesting. But that first film, La Pointe Court, where she breaks all the rules of sound and image relationships, right? It's my favorite part of the film where someone's up close, but you hear their voice really
Right,
far
yeah.
away.
Yeah,
Or the people
absolutely.
way in the background, you hear their voice as if they're right there. So
Yeah.
that tension that she builds, right, is
Right.
just
It's really amazing.
groundbreaking.
I mean,
Yeah.
when I started working on her, nobody had heard of La Pointe Courte. It was actually, Sadoul mentions it, but it was unavailable. You couldn't see it. I sort of gathered a few things when I wrote in my book, but it became this central, she realized how important it was. I mean, she knew that when she was sort of fooling around, and René edited the film. And so, but she was unschooled really in the major sort of articulations of film. But then it became, it's in the 4-box set of the 4 DVD set at Criterion. But anyway, there's tons of stuff. I see very exciting parallels between Abby's work and Varda's work. So that's exciting.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Ruth.
Yeah. Ruth.
Ruth,
Ruth.
unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, the idea of, I think Peter Wallen cited this, the two avant-garde, the American avant-garde and the European avant-garde. And, I found myself between, these feature-length new wave films from Czechoslovakia, from anywhere in Europe, the British parochial co-op, which was kind of parochial, actually, for quite a long time, even though people tell me, like, you can't say that about the British. It was. And the American, so I was between the French and the American,
Right.
and found the short format and the militant East Village kind of scene was like so refreshing for me, to kind of find this place where, as a woman, it was so much better to be, in New York than it was to be in London, where, I mean, basically I was just like ignored, and like, I don't even want to go there. That's not the point. The point, because I always believed in my work, like we just make the work, right? We'll carry on making the work till we drop dead, whichever it is, whether it's poetry or film. We'll just keep making the work. But it's still like, this question of Varda suddenly gets, like cute grandma status, and everyone's like, oh, Varda, and T-shirts with Agnes Varda that, feminist men are wearing, like T-shirts with women filmmakers on. I mean, all these things we're facing. I don't have to say anymore.
That's really great. There's other people look like they wanted to ask a question live here. Look at Maureen Turham's here. Come on, Bruce. Does anyone else want to chime in? Hi, Maureen. So nice to have you here.
Well, it might be time to.
So nice to be here. Abby.
Hi, Maureen.
Hi. Let's talk a little bit about editing and length and duration, since we've been circulating around that, because you've worked at all different lengths of film and you've edited in different media, and I would just love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Well, okay. I actually had thought about something, just digital versus analog editing, maybe. I mean, I haven't analog edited in a long time, but one of the things about analog editing is you can get up just to go to the bin. So it's physically much more active and fun in a way. I mean, more better blues, but mo better for your body. But in digital, one of the things I wanted to talk about was for both Surf and Turf and Cake and Steak, the sound, I actually hacked, and even Unbound, I hacked the digital software. So three different ways to hack the software. For Surf and Turf, on the timeline, for those of you who are filmmakers, it's the timeline that you edit on. I would edit a sequence, and then I would use the cursor and move back and forth on the sequence as if I was playing drums or something, or playing a musical instrument, recording it simultaneously to generate material that then I would edit. to put into Surf and Turf. For any of you who see Surf and Turf, there's a lot of single frame editing, and that's how it was done. It wasn't done in camera, it was done on the timeline. And so that was one way I hacked it. For Cake and Steak, another thing, I was at Yaddo with and met a composer, Joshua Freed, who had figured out a way to hook up to the radio and put it into like a piano keyboard. And he taught me what to do, or he showed me how it worked. He left the room for 3 hours, and I basically did radio. I switched the channels kind of like on the timeline, recording again, because this was that moment where Pro Tools was free and your laptop could become a music studio. It was a fabulous technological moment that lasted maybe a year. And so I could edit, I could generate all this material that was very, overlaid. I could speed it up, slow it down, stretch it, overload it, and I put it into Pro Tools. And then I took that, and that becomes a large part of the soundtrack for Cake and Steak. Analog for Cake and Steak, I also had my sister's 45s. They're older than me, and they had a box of 45s from the 60s, 50s, late 50s, early 60s. And I took the most ragged ones of those, the ones that skipped or beeped or got stuck, and I stuck them in. So it was all about the broken, the torn apart, the breakage that kind of fit the whole movie and the way I felt about the home, the household, the home, the breaking out of suburbia. So then the third thing where I hacked software, kind of the most amazingly crazy part, was with Unbound, which is on the Mary Shelley. And there's a way in which it would unrender. I don't know for anybody in film, and it looks green in the image where it's unrendered. And what happens is when you take it out, it renders automatically. So I got my friend Benton Bainbridge, who's a great artist and technology dude, and he showed me how I could put it in one of the timelines and it wouldn't render automatically. So in Unbound, there's a part of Unbound where you will see a pulsating part of the image, and that's the unrendered image. And what I really liked about Final Cut Pro more than Avid, say, which is another editing system, is Final Cut Pro is it's soft. You can get behind it. You can interface with it in a way that you can. Avid is what documentarians use a lot, and feature filmmakers used to, maybe still do. It's more solid. Like you can locate everything. Final Cut is like more flexible. You can kind of hack it. So that's one way I edited. That's very different, but the digital allowed me to make these kind of creative choices that were unlike other, analog. And what Ruth said, how did I know where to end? Sometimes it's like I used all the material that I had. In the early work, I had so little material, that I would kind of like what I mean, I was very discriminatory as to what I liked and what I would pick. And then I would find, I mean, of course, some stuff doesn't make it, but sometimes you have a beginning, you have an end, and you work through. And sometimes, I suppose it could end anywhere, but to me, it ends in the right place. So what could I say? B-side does, covert action, yes.
Yeah, just thinking about, oh, did I just forget my question? I did, sorry.
That's okay. I can slice one in between because we have from Yoshiko Chuma. She wants you to address ideas from Asian new film and also Middle Eastern films that both basically have also been generated out of the East Village. I hope I'm saying this right, Yoshiko. I don't
know that much about the new film movement, Asian out of the East Village, but I definitely am a huge admirer of the films out of Hong Kong and China and Japan forever. There's let's go on to the throw out your books and go on to the street. I've actually written about it's a weird, fabulous compilation, strange film. I'll have to look up the the Japanese name, and it's very inspiring. It's performance with narrative, with facing the camera. It's like nothing you've ever seen before. But as well, I loved the two most experimental films, Happy Together and Chungking Express. And I think I went to the theater like 4 times to see Happy Together because I was so amazed. And those are films that, you know, use all available light and are shot by that incredible cameraman. I'm forgetting his name. Is Australian, and it's like avant-garde film. He's like lets everything blur. He runs by, and the Chungking Express are two policemen in love with different women, and they just meet at Chungking Express, which is a fast food place. And Happy Together are two gay men who, yeah, Chris Doyle is in fact the camera person, exactly. So I'm a big fan of that, as well as Hao Xiaoxian, as well as, you know, all the traditional Japanese great, you know, filmmakers, and some of the young Japanese filmmakers, some of whom like are teaching in Upper New York State. Yeah, so now the Middle Eastern films, I have seen a number of feature films, but I would just like to recommend right now, because many people don't know it. There's a TV series on Netflix called, I think it's called Ethos. Is that the one? And it's about Turkey, and it's fabulous. It's slow moving, and it's strange, and it's about it's Turkish women, modern and covered women, and the argument between them that is happening in Turkey itself. And you see the modern woman at a bar, and the other woman is still covered and obedient to the men in her life. But it's a very quiet, wonderful series. I cannot recommend it more. In fact, I've been finding, and of course there's the middle, yes, that's it. It's Shuji Terayama. That's fabulous. That's the one, right? I've written about it, so I'm embarrassed, but I didn't remember it right this minute. And that's a fabulous movie. Yeah, Shitzel's great. But you know, there's a bunch of Jewish of stuff from Israel. But I was also thinking, there's the Iranian guy. What did he did 3 features. One of them is still on Netflix called The Separation, and he's done. It's brilliant. And there's 2 more that he's done. And then of course there's the Yugoslavian. I mean, I find, you know, films from all over the world are often much more exciting. There's also the African films. Why am I forgetting? I'm sorry. Senior moments. But there's lots of great films. I mean, search for them. They're out there, and they're much more exciting than what we're getting out of Hollywood by so much. By creative in their editing, their cutting, what they're talking about. All the films from Western Africa are fantastic. Yeah, Farhadi, that's it, Farhadi. Thank you, Ruth. You've got it.
Hey, that's such a great question. What a great answer. And I'm wondering if we could end on Steve Anker's comment, or if Steve Anker, are you still here? Can you turn it into a question maybe? Or is that just, you want to keep it as a comment? The most radical and anti-robotic. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I'd rather just keep it as the comment, but also to see what it might provoke.
Yeah, so I'm going to read that.
What was it? Would you?
The most radical and anti-robotic aspects of Abby's films is how they confound memory, especially the assumed memory within cinema experience, through close but false repetition and rhyming. Brilliant. Abby.
I don't know what to say, except what can I say? I have to say, along with Ruth, when I've looked back on, I had to prepare covert action for somebody, and I had to look at it like 3 times to make sure there was no mistake. And I was touched that it was completely relevant. You know, it was 35 years old, and it was right on target. And it said things, not that I didn't know it when I made it, but I had forgotten. So maybe that's a place with the memory of cinema experience, that those speedy, I mean, the speedy films, people, you know, my poet friends, my music friends loved, but I had lots of curators say, you know, too many notes.
Like Mozart.
You know, too many notes. We can't write it. We can't include it. We were not looking. I tried in the later works to keep your mind moving as much as in the fast ones, but that it didn't always have to be that singular rhythm. It's like I wanted to be able to do more than one stage of rhythm. And I really appreciate Cindy Sherman when she says, "Oh, everybody always likes best the work they met you in." you know, and I think that's true. And I'd like people to go on.
Mhm. I
Abigail,
think that's a beautiful note to end on, right? Sarah, can we all give a big hand to
yeah,
Abby
let's-
Child
and let me say,
and the Film Co-op and Ken Jacobs and Ruth Novacek and all the glorious people who came tonight. What beautiful contributions and presence.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I just want to say we have a young filmmaker. His name's Matthew Carlson. We've been alternating every other week with, and he's showing his films on Zoom next Saturday at 6. And I would like to invite you all to come and see his work. It's really unique and original. And he's a young filmmaker just starting out that I hope you'll come to. And one country that I was invited to that I was surprised how profound their experimental film scene was Uruguay in South America. And I stayed at what was a former woman's prison, and that they turned into an art center, contemporary art center. And I found out a lot about the United States of America by being in South America and Uruguay, a country that the United States kept a brutal dictator in. But they not only showed films, they fed films were free, the food was free, and they had an amazing film lab with no running water. They carried water up, but their film scene was very political and hand processed and beautiful. Thank you, Melissa Ragona, for moderating.
Always a pleasure.
Ken
Thank you,
and
everyone. Have a
Ken
beautiful week.
Jacob.
Thank you, Abby Child, for being just
Thank
you
you.
and alive and everything
Abby,
you
you get
produced.
the
We
last
love you.
word.
Fine. I'm
Give
happy.
the last word. Mayhem.
Make
Love you.
films. Keep making films.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Louise. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.